You should forgive me for stealing some money. After all, we're family. That was my husband's justification when he was taking money from my purse. However, when he was initially caught, he didn't say anything as severe. Instead, he sincerely apologized and paid me back. I ended up being lenient, but it was later revealed that he had also been stealing from our son. When I found out, I resolved to disclose his wrongdoings to our son and mother-in-law who lived with us. There's no need to be considerate any longer to a man who causes trouble not only to me, but also to our son. I've kept quiet so far, but the truth is that my husband. In a fit of anger, I exposed Greg's misconducts. My name is Mary Miller. I'm 46, working part-time and a housewife at home. I married Greg 20 years ago. He's a serious company employee, and I think he's a good husband. Now we're living as a family of 4, including our 17-year-old son Mark, and my mother-in-law, Mrs. Deborah. Lately, Mark has been cold more often, perhaps because of his rebellious phase. But Mark is a kind boy at heart and is currently working hard studying for college admission. I believe this rebellious phase will pass in time, so it's a matter of enduring till then. Mrs. Deborah recently lost her husband due to an illness. She originally lived with her husband, but after his death, we thought it would be hard for the elderly Mrs. Deborah to continue living alone, so she moved in with us. However, having lost her beloved husband, Mrs. Deborah has been down for a while. She's usually mild-mannered and laughs a lot, so her current state was worrisome. I tried to be as gentle as I could with Mrs. Deborah, in an attempt to alleviate her emotional burden. Despite these issues, we were a normal family living reasonably happy days. However, happiness proved to be a fragile thing, capable of collapsing without warning. One day, I went shopping, and when I tried to pay, I realized 3 $10 bills were missing. I had withdrawn it from the ATM the previous day and had definitely put it in my purse. The purse was securely closed in my bag, and it was unlikely that the bills would slip out and fall on the road. Could it be that someone took it? A nasty suspicion crossed my mind, but there was no solid evidence. The loss was only $30, so I decided not to pursue it further and observe the situation. However, the next morning, more money was missing. This time $50 was gone. It was definitely in my purse when I checked last night. The purse had been in the house all night, and there were no signs of a thief. Unpleasant as the thought was, I could only assume someone in the family took it. I decided to consult Greg about it. When I explained the situation in detail, Greg, looking evasive, said, "Actually, I know who the culprit is. It's Mark. He was rummaging through your bag when he woke up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom. Maybe he thinks it's okay to do this much to his parents because he's in his rebellious phase." I couldn't believe it. No matter how rebellious, Mark wouldn't resort to stealing money. Greg's shifting gaze was also concerning. So, I proposed this. "All right, I'll talk to Mark myself. I think he might be more willing to talk to me since we don't spend much time together." Greg readily agreed to this. It wasn't that I believed what Greg said. Rather, his nervousness made me suspicious. I thought it might be best to clarify the perpetrator. I bought a small surveillance camera and installed it in an inconspicuous place. I positioned it so that it would capture my purse, which I left untouched for a day. Checking my wallet, another $50 is gone. Checked the recorded footage, and there was the culprit. It wasn't Mark. It was Greg. Making sure there was no one around, he didn't hesitate to take money from my wallet. Seeing this, I felt intense anger. Stealing money is bad enough, but trying to frame my son was something I couldn't forgive. When I confronted Greg with the evidence, he was flustered and stuttered, "No, that's not it, I mean." "What do you mean that's not it? It's clear as day that you're the one stealing. Why would you do such a thing?" Greg began to explain in resignation. "I have a gambling debt. I was desperate for money." I was completely thrown off. I had no idea that Greg was gambling or that he had a debt. "Is that true?" "Yeah, it's not a lie." Greg brought out some documents. They indicated that he was in debt for a total of $5,000. "Oh no." I was at a loss for words. Greg began to desperately explain. "I thought you would be mad if I told the truth, so I blamed Mark. I'm sorry for lying and keeping my debt a secret. I have a plan to pay it back, and I'm slowly repaying it from my salary. I'll make sure Mark goes to college and you won't have any trouble living." Greg apologized many times and repaid the money. Since he seemed genuinely remorseful, I decided to forgive him.
All right, I'll trust you this one time. But if you do it again, I won't forgive you.
I was stern in my warning, but I didn't want to worry Mark or Mrs. Deborah unnecessarily, so I decided to keep quiet for the time being. But as they say, trouble comes in threes. This was just the beginning of real hardships. A week after the debt was revealed, Greg kept his promise and stopped stealing money from my purse. But when Greg came home, he looked very gloomy and said, "My salary has been cut." According to Greg, his company was not doing well recently, and his salary had to be cut. Almost by $1,000.
With a debt and Mark's college tuition to save up for, what are we supposed to do?
I was at a loss. After thinking about it, I decided to take on more part-time work. I started working at a 24-hour fast food restaurant from late at night until early morning. It would be physically tough, but the night shift paid more, so I decided to give it a try. Obviously, I had to tell Mark and Mrs. Deborah about this, so I called them into the living room. Then, Mark said he had something serious to discuss, so I decided to listen to his story first. I thought it would be about his studies or college plans, but what he said was completely unexpected.
For about a week, money has been disappearing from my piggy bank. Yesterday, I saw Dad opening my piggy bank without my permission. When I asked him what he was doing, he dodged the question. It was suspicious.
Hearing this, I was at a loss for words. Mrs. Deborah had a look of disbelief on her face. Could it be Greg had changed his target to Mark? The idea of a husband stealing money from his own son was unthinkable. But then again, Greg has a history of trying to pin his own guilt on Mark, and he's strapped for cash. At that moment, Mrs. Deborah said something shocking.
When Greg was in high school, he once tried to steal a video game he had borrowed from a classmate. I thought it was okay because I scolded him severely.
Come to think of it, things frequently disappeared when I was a member of my college club. Greg was also a member of that club. By this point, it was only natural to consider Greg as the culprit. For now, I decided to hold on to Mark's piggy bank.
So, you have something to say to us too, right? What's going on?
Mark asked me, so I told them both. Actually, I have to take on a part-time job morning and night.
Why? Do you and Greg not have enough money?
Mrs. Deborah asked. I was not sure how much to say, but I decided to tell them everything. There's no need to tiptoe around a man who not only inconveniences me, but also our son.
I've kept it from you too, but actually, my husband.
I confessed Greg's misdeeds, seething with anger. 2 weeks later, Mark, Mrs. Deborah and I intercepted Greg, who claimed to be going to work on his day off, and brought him to the living room.
What's going on? I'm going to be late for work, make it quick.
I looked at Greg with a cold stare as he said that.
You're lying about going to work on your day off, aren't you? You've really quit your job.
Greg's face turned pale instantly.
What are you talking about? There's no way I quit my job. How many lies do you have to tell to be satisfied? I called your company and asked them directly, there's no mistake.
When I yelled at him like that, Greg froze, his body trembling.
You supposedly resigned for personal reasons. But the truth is you were stealing money from your coworkers' wallets and quit because you were about to get caught, right?
Greg stared in disbelief, seemingly shocked that I knew even this. I had called one of Greg's former colleagues who reluctantly told me.
About 2 months ago, a female employee was making a fuss about money missing from her wallet. After that, similar incidents kept happening. Greg mentioned he had debts at a party, and he was always looking at people's wallets and bags. Plus, in his department, there were rumors that things always went missing. It was just pens and clips, and the loss was insignificant. There was no evidence of theft, so they've been handling it quietly.
His colleague never claimed Greg was the culprit, but it seemed like he believed Greg was very likely involved.
You're the one who did it, aren't you?
When I sternly asked him that, Greg answered with a frightened nod, yes. But that wasn't the only secret Greg had. I pulled out an envelope and took out a few photos. Greg instantly looked away when he saw them, but I shoved them in front of his face. The photos showed Greg and a beautiful woman holding hands and walking.
This clearly looks like an affair, doesn't it? I hired a private investigator to look into it. Be ready to pay child support.
As I glared at Greg, he frantically started babbling about his affair.
I met her randomly on the street. I fell in love with her before I knew it. She told me she truly loves me too. I was even angrier now, so I decided to deliver another blow to Greg. Greg, do you know your mistress's real name? Of course, it's Emily Davis, right? To Greg, who was wondering why I asked that, I revealed the truth. Sorry. That's a pseudonym. Her real name is Jessica Turner. She has a criminal record for fraud. No, that's a lie. There's no way Emily would commit fraud. Greg remained adamantly in denial, so I searched Jessica Turner on my smartphone and showed him an online article. In the article, Jessica Turner had been arrested for fraud, and there was a photo of her face. It was the same face as Greg's mistress. Well, are you ready to believe it now? Don't you think she got close to you just to swindle your money? When I said this with a disgusted tone, Greg murmured, "No way," and seemed to collapse. Seeing Greg's face filled with despair, I felt a small sense of relief in my chest. This was his punishment for cheating. But even so, it was almost poetic that a liar like Greg would be approached by a fraudster. Birds of a feather flock together, as they say. I was angry, but at the same time, I was also flabbergasted. But there was still something left that I wanted to say to Greg. I showed Greg a piece of paper. It was a divorce paper that I had asked a lawyer to prepare. I can't be married to a man like you anymore. You'd better prepare yourself for a divorce. But then Greg said, "Please forgive me. I have debts and I've lost my job. If you divorce me now, I'll be in financial trouble. I admit that I've stolen various things, but it's not a significant amount of money. I only intended to borrow it, and I plan to return it. Besides, we're family. Can't you forgive me for stealing money?" He chose another woman over me. Now he's asking for forgiveness. He says he intended to return it, but I doubt how much of that is true. I was about to yell at Greg. But then, a loud voice said, "Enough is enough." It was Mrs. Deborah. It's not about the amount of money or family. Stealing from others is wrong. How can you not understand that even as an adult? And to top it off, you cheated. I can no longer see you as my son. Please let me cut ties with you. Greg's face instantly looked like he was about to cry. You're my mother, right? Can't you defend me a little? Because he had the audacity to beg like that, I decided to give him a piece of my mind. When I told Mrs. Deborah about your debts and how you stole my money, she was unbelievably angry. It was Mrs. Deborah who suggested calling your employer and hiring a private investigator. As I explained why I had to take a part-time job, Mrs. Deborah yelled, "What? What is he thinking? Causing trouble for his precious family." There was absolutely no trace of the usually mild-mannered Mrs. Deborah. She was more angry than I had ever seen her before. We can't let this go. We have to take revenge. Greg might be hiding something else, so let's investigate thoroughly this time. She said this and quickly laid out a plan for revenge. It's true what they say, the kindest people are the scariest when they get angry. When I pointed this out, Greg must have realized that even his mother wouldn't help him. This time, he clung to Mark. Hey, Mark, you're a high schooler, but you wouldn't want to lose your dad, would you? Stand up for me. But Mark, his face bright red, glared at Greg. I don't need a dad who steals and cheats. How dare you betray Mom? Being abandoned by his son, Greg finally seemed to realize that he had no allies left. He was crying, but when Mrs. Deborah told him to apologize to Mary and Mark properly, with a stern voice, he was pressured by her intensity and kept apologizing. I'm really sorry. I've reflected on my actions. It was too late for apologies. I couldn't possibly forgive him. If you're truly remorseful, listen to my wish. Agree to the divorce immediately. If you have any objections, hire a lawyer. I thrust the divorce papers at him again, and finally, Greg seemed to accept our divorce. Afterwards, we reclaimed the money Greg stole and kicked him out of the house. We filed for divorce. Then, through our lawyer, we made a claim for child support. Perhaps finally sensing the gravity of the situation, he made a lump sum payment. After that, it seemed Greg was in serious financial trouble. Due to not only gambling but also lavishing luxury items on his mistress, he had accumulated actual debt of about $10,000. He must have racked up an astronomical amount of debt considering the amount he continued borrowing, but that's not my concern. Moreover, Greg was abandoned by his mistress. Probably, she was just after his money. Greg seemed to want to sue her for fraud, but since he was the one who voluntarily lavished her, he gave up in the end. Furthermore,
2 months after the divorce, Greg was arrested for embezzling money from his company. I made sure to inform Greg's former company that he had been a habitual thief. We considered turning him into the police ourselves, but we decided to leave it to the people of the victimized company. Considering my husband has a habit of lying, there might still be things he's hiding. Probably because I warned them, the company seemed to thoroughly investigate their finances. As a result, Greg's embezzlement was exposed. I wonder how much crime that man needs to commit to be satisfied. It was definitely the right decision to sever ties with him. If not careful, I might have been implicated in his crimes. With Greg, the breadwinner, gone, I managed to secure a full-time job through an acquaintance. I have enough income to support Mark and Mrs. Deborah. Mrs. Deborah is also working part-time. When I divorced Greg, Mrs. Deborah said, "I'm sorry my son has caused you so much trouble. I can't impose on you any longer, so I'll leave." However, living alone as a senior can be worrisome, and both Mark and I love Mrs. Deborah very much.
Greg and you are completely different people. I consider you as part of my precious family, so please stay with us forever.
I managed to convince her to stay with that. Mrs. Deborah seems to have regained her vitality a little by working part-time and living her new life. Recently, she's been smiling more. Mark, too, who was deeply shocked by the recent incident, seems to be regaining his energy. Perhaps understanding our home situation, he even helps out with household chores sometimes. It seemed peaceful days were about to return to our home. I'm trying to forget about Greg and walk my own life path with a positive mindset. I want to keep working hard to support my family. I feel like a bright future is waiting.